So it's not about just being quiet. It's not about worshiping the silence. It's not about even keeping silent the whole time, but it's about getting silent enough that we actually hear God with us.
Hi, I'm Rachel Bomberger with Eerdmans Publishing. I'm here today with Brent Bill, who is the author of Holy Silence, The Gift of Quaker Spirituality. Welcome, Brent.
Thanks, Rachel. It's good to be here.
How did this book about silence, which seems like an unusual subject to speak about for a long time, how did this come to be?
Yeah, you would think you wouldn't be speaking or writing about silence. It should just be a blank sort of book. But it really grew out of a conversation that I had with Lil Copan, my editor, years ago when we were driving across Indiana to go to a writers' conference. And I was waxing eloquent about the sunlight falling on the freshly harvested fields. And Lil was like, I don't see it. And so I tried to explain the spirituality of light and so forth. And she said, I think you see that because you're a Quaker. And I said, what? And I said, I think I see it because I'm a photographer. But she said, no, it really has to do with the way I think your stillness and the way you talk about it helps prepare you to see the beauty in the ordinary. And so we began talking about that silence in the Quaker way is not just about being quiet. It's about really getting quiet to notice the movement of God in our lives, both individually and corporately. And so by the end of the weekend, she's saying, I think that might make a good book. How would you like to tackle that? And so I did, right when I was in the middle of building a new house out in the country, and I'm a city boy, so this was an interesting kind of time to actually help me practice what I was writing about in the midst of all this hectic life.
Now you are, as Lil rightly discerned, you're uniquely qualified to write about this, being a Quaker. For those people who may not be familiar with the Friends, can you tell us a little bit, what is distinctive about the Quaker approach to spirituality?
Well, the Quakers were born basically in the mid-17th century in England when the English Civil War was going on, which was a religious war, unlike the American Civil War, which we think about state rights or slavery. But it really was about religious practice. And the Quakers were getting sort of fed up with rites and rituals being controlled by the state, since it was a state church. And so they began to gather together in silence, without rite or ritual, without a priest, to listen to God together. And that sort of grew out of our founding member, George Fox, who was a spiritual seeker and kept hungering after God. But he only really found his soul satisfied when he was silent, reading his Bible, listening for the voice of God, and he heard a voice that said, there's one, even Christ Jesus, who can speak to your condition. And so Quakers gather in silence without rite or ritual to listen collectively for the voice of God to the community. So it's not about just being quiet. It's not about worshiping the silence. It's not about even keeping silent the whole time, but it's about getting silent enough that we actually hear God with us and speaking. As Jesus said, where two or three are gathered, there I will be with you. And we believe that Christ is present with us when we are silent and still.
You refer to in the book to this sacramental silence, and speak of silence as being the sacrament for you. Can you explore that a little bit more fully?
Well, my understanding of a sacrament, and Quakers are non-sacramental people in the sense that we don't have outward rites or rituals or sacraments, but we believe all of life is sacramental, imbued with the idea that God and God's grace can break through at any moment if we're prepared to pay attention to it. And so the silence is a sacramental moment in the same way I would compare it to the elevation of the host in a Catholic ceremony. I mean, a most powerful moment when the real presence of Christ is there. Quakers believe that in the silence, it is the real presence of Christ. It's not just a metaphor. We really believe Christ is there. And so in that moment, silence is a sacrament for us because grace is at work among us. And we can see it, in some ways, visibly on people's faces, and in their postures and their breathing, and then sometimes in their words when they stand and share out of this silence something that Spirit has laid on their heart.
I think there are probably a lot of people who have experienced that. I mean, churches that aren't Quaker often don't leave much time for silence.
Right.
But those that do, the people who are there find the silence very powerful and very moving,
Right.
even as it can sometimes be very, very uncomfortable.
I remember when I was a young college student, and I was invited to be a youth pastor at a Methodist church. And they paid better than the Quakers, so I thought, oh, that sounds good. So I went, and one of my tasks every Sunday was to lead the Lord's Prayer as part of the liturgy of the church. And one day I was praying, got us started, and my mind went blank. I couldn't remember, the next words, but I wasn't worried because I knew everybody would just follow along. But they didn't. They all got very quiet. And finally I remembered, and we went on, and at the end of the service, people said, that pause was so meaningful, because we rushed through everything.
Yeah.
And so thank you for bringing that Quaker sensibility of getting us to pause. And then, of course, I wanted to say, well, thank you, wasn't that brilliant? But I had to admit that, no, I had just forgotten. But I do think it speaks something. We don't give enough time to silence, to hear the voice of God. We too often in services rush through them. We look at the bulletin, check off where we are as we go through, or some of us who are shallow do. But this intensified pause, this holy hush, can really help us think about what we've just said or what we've just heard. I mean, we have some Quaker meetings who are pastoral, probably about half, but the pacing is completely different because it's slower. We try and, after a hymn is sung, to be quiet and reflect on what we've seen. Where was God in that? And I think more congregations could actually do that. Not Quaker, but any, just to find more spaces. In an odd way, it doesn't lengthen the service. It makes it more intense and real, and engages us in the life of the Spirit in a way that we walk out knowing we've not just talked about God or heard about God, but we have actually met God.
And this is a book that, we've talked a lot about churches so far, but this book is profoundly personal. It's written in a personal way, and it's intended for personal use. And you include not just sort of like academic discussions of silence and personal accounts, but also these quietude queries that are throughout the book that encourage the reader to put the book down and actually engage in silence. Why did you think that was such an important thing to include in the book?
Well, when I first wrote it and was all done, I thought, again, Lil, who's not only a fabulous editor but a good friend, and this was 12 years ago, began to say, we need something more. And a concern of mine has always been to be invitational in my writing, and to invite people into the experience. And so I remembered the Quaker practice of what we call queries, which we don't have a creed, so we don't all recite, but we ask ourselves spiritual questions, and we call them the queries. And there's no right answer. There's the right answer for you and where you are at this spiritual moment. So I thought, well, that could be fun as a way to break up the text. Instead of just talking about how to do silence, to actually invite the reader to practice what they just read about. And so we sprinkled the Quietude Queries throughout the entire book. They're not exercises at the end, although there are more at the end, but actually throughout, the reader will stop and practice part of what they've just learned, but it's personal. It's not towards a certain end or anything. It's just for their own spiritual enrichment. And I've heard from folks who've read the book over the last 12 years, the first edition, that was one of the most meaningful exercises, was this chance to actually stop and reflect right in the middle of the reading on a particular piece.
I gotta say, I think they're right. There's something really powerful about these. As I was reading through, in preparation for our conversation, at first I thought, I'll just skip past these. I'll get to the real meat and potatoes of the book. But then I thought, I really need to try a couple of them. And I did, and I was incredibly surprised by how hard they were, but also how powerful. But I think when you are not used to being silent, and you try to be silent, I noticed that my head was full of noise, even if my mouth was shut.
Yeah.
How do you turn that off?
You don't. I mean, I think that's part of it, is we all have sort of monkey mind. All these chattering monkeys up there going on. Did I turn off the oven? What about, is it time to pick the kids up from school? Whatever. And I think part of it, of Quaker Silence, it's really unique, is it doesn't require a certain amount of time. I mean, obviously, if we're in worship and we have an extended period, we have a chance to calm that piece. And there are techniques, and there's some in the book about how to do that. But if we're taking a moment for holy silence during the day, and we're looking, say, at the queries, it's fine to let that crowd in, because that's where God is too. I mean, it's all these things that are going on, we can find, part of the purpose of the queries is to make us stop and begin to think, and that's what makes them hard, because we got so much to do. But if we stop and begin to contemplate God, then all of a sudden we realize that we can enter into a place, as St. Paul says, where we're praying without ceasing, that we're going about our life's business, and underneath there's this pool of calm, because we have learned to practice silence and spiritual questions, and be able to take our thoughts and hand them off to God. And if they sink into the infinite ocean of love that God surrounds us with, then they're sort of gone. And if they bob back up to the surface, then it's something like, you need to be paying attention to this, and you may not have even known it.
It sounds like this is the kind of practice that one could practice for a lifetime and never quite master.
Yeah. I certainly have been trying it for many years, and I mean, and part of it is people often say, well, you're a Quaker, so you're probably predisposed to silence. But I'm not. I mean, I'm not predisposed. I'm predisposed to busyness. I'm kind of a type A person. I mean, I work a full-time job, I write books, and I manage our farm. There's lots going on, lots of work. So I actually need this practice to teach me. And I'm better at it now than I was 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but there's still so many depths to be plumbed, and the silence helps me do that. The silence with attention to God.
Well, it's a beautiful book, a beautiful way of life, one that I'm very glad personally to have been exposed to, and I'm so glad that you could be with us today.
Oh, I'm delighted. This has been fun to talk about.